Hey guys, my name is Dale Tedder, and welcome to the Walking Points podcast. This is the third attempt to start the podcast today, but you don't know it because of editing. But I'm with my friends and fellow pastors, David Mullins and David Preston, and God bless editing. I wish we could do real time editing. You
Oh,
wouldn't that be great if you put your foot in your mouth, you can just edit it out in real life. Anyway, we started a series a couple weeks ago. In fact, last week was our hurricane edition because we were under a hurricane.
Eye of the storm.
The eye of the
yes.
storm. Thankfully, here in Jacksonville, we mentioned this last week, but here in Jacksonville, we didn't get a lot. But certainly West Florida did. And South Georgia, as it turns out,
Yes.
got a lot. So certainly our prayers are with them. But so this is our third time meeting together, and we're doing a series called Thinking Christianly. And this first part, this first leg of this series, however long this series lasts, is called The Mind of Christ. And we're working through a devotional series by T.M. Moore called The Mind of Christ. And it's part of a bigger series called Renewing Your Mind. And, I think what I'm discovering, guys, is as we do this more and more and reflect on this more and more, you see how much the mind, thinking, the way God wants us to think, plays such an important role. I mean, I think we would all say that's the case, but it really, the more scripture I'm reading on it, it just keeps showing up over and over again. Things I probably glossed over, didn't really pay much attention to. I mean, I got the gist of it, but TM for this particular devotional begins with Ephesians 4:17 through 20, and I wanted to read that, and I'll try to emphasize some of the key ideas that I think he's going for, and then I might just highlight a couple paragraphs. They're pretty short that he shared that really jumped out at me. See if there was anything you guys jumped out at you, and then we'll work through some questions and reflect on them together. But so this is Ephesians 4:17 through 20. And I'm so used to seeing this language in Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 1. He uses a lot of the foolishness or the futility of their thinking. But I forgot that it's in Ephesians as well until I, was preparing for this. So it says, so I tell you this, and this is instructions for Christian living is what my NIV has for the heading of this. It says, so I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. And then verse 20 says, that, however, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. Now, it's interesting. The NIV has that sentence end, the truth that is in Jesus, but I wanted to read the ESV because I think in the Greek it continues. It's the NIV kind of fixes up some language issues, to kind of help it, to give you the gist of it, but give you a better read, a smoother read, maybe is a better way of putting it. But the ESV, keeps it going. It's more of a word for word as opposed to a phrase for phrase. And I'll just start with verse 20 again for the ESV. It says, but that is not the way you learned Christ, ! Assuming that you have heard about him and were taught in him as the truth is in Jesus. All right. And it keeps going. To put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires, and to be renewed in the spirit of your minds, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. So I love that. Paul, it seems like everything we've been reading so far, he's talking about heart and mind together. And last night I just began a Bible study on our Wednesday evening fellowship night, and it's on the Great Commandment. And how are we to love God? With all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I think the very first time we met together, we talked about the idea that we're whole beings, so we can't compartmentalize. This is only my mind, and this is only my soul, and this is only my heart. And, so just the emotions, or just the thinking, or just the the volition or the will. But it's all tangled up together. And so when our thinking is of this world, we start living very often, as the world. So I think the Apostle Paul is really concerned about, because he says this in several places throughout his epistles, and he says it here. He says, but that's not how you learned Christ. That's not what you were taught, assuming that you were. And then he says in other places, he'll say, you used to be like that. Remember when you were a Gentile. Remember when you were an unbeliever. That's where you were then. But now you have a new mind. You have the mind of Christ. And so you don't have to live that way anymore. I mean, that's great, isn't it? We have the resources of heaven. We have the mind of Christ that is informing us. And as it informs us, it begins to mold and shape our wills and our desires. And twice Paul mentions that. He talks about the hardness of the heart. And I think that's really tied in there with the idea of, deceitful desires. And isn't it in Jeremiah where Jeremiah says, the heart is deceitful, above all things. And so, the unregenerate heart that has not been redeemed by the Holy Spirit and the work of Christ still desires those old things. And if we haven't put them off, and been renewed in Christ, and our minds, the mind of Christ is not being renewed in us, it's so easy to start going back. I mean, I know even as somebody who is a follower of Jesus Christ, if I'm not regularly in the Word, I start drifting back. I mean, is that kind of your thoughts? What are some things that from the reading, we'll just kind of stick with the reading right now, and maybe some ideas you had from that. David Mullins, what are some thoughts you had on some of this?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was listening to the Art of Holiness podcast this morning, and I just got like the first 10 or 15 minutes in while I was getting ready, but they had David Watson on a couple weeks back, and we're talking about, what it's like when the church looks like the world. And you could taper that down to when believers look like the world. What do we even have to offer? And that's not who we're called to be. And there's a lot of things in this world that will absolutely call to some of the values that we hold, but offer us a whole package of things that do not belong to the Christian mind, and try to pull your allegiance in with, the handful of issues that get you all riled up when you're watching the news. But
isn't that what Congress does?
Yes. Yeah. They stuff the bill.
Support this bill. Oh, and by the way.
Yeah. This is a bill against kicking puppies. Right. Oh, and also it gives us all bonuses. But that's the way of the world, is to and the way of the enemy. The biggest enemy of truth is partial truth. And so, that's something that, as we're seeking to have the mind of Christ, we need to be on guard against the counterfeits that are right next door. That feel, and when you're supporting those, it feels like you're standing against the world, because you can look on the other side and go, oh, there's all that horrible stuff over there that I'm standing against. But, it's like the turn from Romans 1 to Romans 2, Paul. Which almost feels like a bait and it's not a bait and switch necessarily, but he's like, here's all these horrible things that we see in the world. All of these who worship the creation rather than the creator, they do all these things. Romans 2 starts out, and you're no better.
Right. So, right. No, that's a good word.
You were offended by idols. Do you rob temples? That whole, yeah.
Yeah. Because Romans 1 is Gentiles and Romans 2 is all to the Jews. And so it's like, you could see, because I think we Christians can do this as well. I mean, it's really a good word that you gave about not letting the, don't let the bill that's being proposed bring in a lot of stuff that's counterfeit,
Yeah.
So, and I like what you said, that the greatest enemy of truth is partial truth. I mean,
Yes.
that's a good word, because I really feel like, if Satan appears to us as an angel of light, light's good, right? I
Mhm.
mean, Jesus is
Oh
the Lord
yeah.
of light. That's good stuff. But man, if you don't have your discernment turned up, and tuned in and turned up,
Yeah.
then yeah, there's no telling what kind of stuff you're going to allow in to your heart and to your mind and to your life. That's a really good word. David Preston, what were some thoughts you had on that?
Well, I actually my mind's going a couple of different directions this morning. I came into it thinking, and I still think one of the most important things thinking about this is back to Romans 12:2 again, not being conformed, not being
Mhm.
made in the image of this world or its values, but being transformed by the renewing of your mind. Focus on the on Christ. What does Christ represent? Who is the being of Christ? But as listening to the other comments, I'm also thinking, and the reading as well. I'm thinking about, he talks about the computer, the issue of the computer, knowing what the
Mhm.
computer, but I thought about it in terms of having the mind of Christ is kind of like having the program, allowing yourself to operate on these principles. That's essentially what a computer program is. I mean, and that's a very simplistic sort of way, but the bottom line is if your program is not right, you're not going to be able to do what you need to do. It's going to crash. It's going to fall apart. Um, Back to we did last weekend, Dale, in your book, we did the one about the wise and foolish builders. And so my revelation in doing that, my sort of my Homer Simpson dope moment in that was never making the connection, because I've never dealt with them together, between the wise and foolish builder story being at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. I've always dealt with it as a separate thing. And the reality that all those things, this is what it means to be
Mhm.
a follower of Christ. This is what it means to build on solid ground, and it'll look the same. The house will look the same. That's a very good point that you make, is that the two houses are going to look the same, but one's going to look being built on sand, one's going to be built on rock, and the storms are going to come, and the one that's on the sand is going to be wiped out.
Yeah.
And so yes, for us, that's the danger of that sort of ideology in the church, is it's going to look the same. People are going to sing the same hymns.
Right.
We're going to talk about love an awful lot, but
Right.
we're going to mean very different things.
Yeah.
And that is kind of a bottom line and a very timely understanding, the
Yeah.
Mhm.
difference between what the world means about love, and right, what's love got to do with it, and what God means about love, holy love,
Yeah.
um, this and the significant difference there.
Yeah.
So having the mind of Christ, having the heart of Christ, having the being of Christ, heart, mind, soul, strength, all of those, that's Christ's being. That's being transformed. There's that, sanctifying grace. Whatever images that you want to have from scripture or concepts, it is about us being transformed on the inside. So we don't just look like Christians. We are Christians from the in, we are Christ followers from the inside out.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, that's a good word. It's interesting listening to both of your comments. Um, yeah, even right now I'm feeling some conviction, but when I was reading the material, gosh, I think I was like, yep, my doctrine is pure. Yep, I've got good theology. I'm soundly orthodox. I'm pursuing holiness and all that sort of thing. And then listening to y'all and that Romans 1 and 2 shift there, like, ugh. But there was one paragraph. This is where this is where the conviction really came pouring in, because I realized, all right, this is when I'm not accessing the mind of Christ. I'm not utilizing it, or it's not active in my life. I really don't know how to communicate that. But listen to this paragraph. He says, the old mind. Okay. So he's not even talking about, worshiping idols and um, ungodly practices and false doctrine. I mean, that's
Mhm.
obvious, right? But listen to this. The old mind sees only familiar roads. It expects potholes and detours, traffic jams, and road rage. Guilty. but it says the old mind lives in the past and is unable to imagine anything other than what it's always known and done. The old mind wants things to remain the same. It can't be troubled to learn, and it prefers to go along with the spirit of the age and not to rock any boats. The old man cannot see, or the old mind cannot see the glory of God, nor the possibilities for revival, renewal, and awakening. The old mind affirms beliefs, but it hesitates to act on them, lest it seem to be out of step with the times. And then he says right after that, we are called to put off such old mind thinking. And so he mentions this elsewhere, but when I find fear is getting the best of me, like, uncharted territory, what will happen if, what if I stand firm here? Or,
right.
It's, David Mullins, David Preston and I, we used to have a fellow in our Monday night men's group who used to say, a rut is, just a grave with the ends kicked out or something, it's just, it's, when you get in a rut and you just keep going, you're just oblivious to everything because it's what it's right in front of you. You just keep going. And I just found the conviction for me was, all right, if I have a new mind, I have the mind of Christ, I have the Spirit of God living in me, why am I afraid to trust God that he wants to use me in this way or something? So it really becomes, I think, very convicting. Christians need to hear this mind of Christ thing. This isn't just for, hey, you guys who are unbelievers, you could have the mind of Christ and you could think like Christians think. Christians need to say, hey, Christians, you need to think like Christians think. And really, more importantly, hey, Christians, you need to think like Jesus thinks.
Right.
And that was really, well, I needed to hear it, but it was still hard to hear. But what are some thoughts you have on some of that?
One of the things that struck me as I was looking at that paragraph and hearing you read it again, it's a challenge if you've grown up in the church, which a lot of our members have, to see the difference between the old mind and the new mind. Because if you've gotten a little more discipleship, hopefully, if you've gotten a little more biblical training into you from the beginning. But I sometimes, like when I was a teenager, one of our youth pastors was all about bringing in these guys who had these dramatic conversions from dealing drugs on the corner and listening to rock music to squeaky clean Christian. And it's kind of easy if you've had this very black and white stark difference, but it's another thing when you've grown up and did all your we're living in the old nature still whilst attending church. And then trying to go, okay, something different happened. A lot of us had a very subtle change moment. Some of us had more dramatic, but how do I distinguish how I lived before from how I'm called to live now? And I think that's one of the things we struggle with in a lot of churches is people, we've all, and I'm including myself in this, I came to Christ through confirmation class in a Methodist church. I was 11 and decided, man, I need to take this seriously. I've been living in this my whole life, but I need to choose this for myself. Making the distinction then to say, okay, I need to test my heart and my mind. I need to go back and, at this stage in my life, looking at, what are the values I've carried forward that were of the old mind, but I didn't realize it. And that's a lifelong pursuit. You don't ever finish that. I don't think. Wesley arguably says you can finish it in this life. I don't know that I buy it, but so
heretic.
Yeah. I don't know if that's in our theological standards, Dale. But
it's interesting, the idea about growing up in the things that we smuggle into the Christian life that aren't Christian.
Yes.
And we think, David Preston, go ahead.
I was going to say, in American culture over the last 100 years, it hasn't even been smuggled in. I mean, it's just been a part of the experience, I go back to, and I beat this dead horse, I know, all the time, but the idea, all the times that I've known people who say, I have sat in church my whole life, I've never heard this before.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and yeah, it happens on Emmaus weekends. It happens in other experiences, and it's because for a long time in the American church anyway, you went to church, you sat in the pew. It wasn't, you know, that was just what you did. There wasn't anything emphasized about transformation, changing yourself, whatever. You could do what you could live however you wanted to the other 6 days of the week, actually the other 6 3/4 days of the week.
Right.
You know, essentially, especially on football season. But the on Sunday morning you were in church, and it did not impact what happened in the rest of your life at all. And so that's why the church is dying, you know, because that sort of attitude, because now people have realized, well, gee, if I'm not getting anything, why do I even go at all? And so
well, let me ask you this, David, real quick. I mean, that same thought. David Preston, you and I went to the same seminary, and you probably studied this as well, David. I don't know if y'all read any Robert Bella, but I don't know if he coined the phrase.
No, we taught the Bible at our.
You taught.
Sorry,
I'm not editing that out. You're gonna have to live with that one. But we were studying Robert Bella in one of the classes. Mm-hmm. I don't know if he coined the phrase civil religion, but it's very much what you were talking about, David Preston, about the idea of you went to church because you're an American.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And that's what Americans do. And then what you started seeing toward the end, you know, in the 60s, and you saw this shift where it became so hyper individualized. One of the phrases he used, or people he mentioned, was this woman named Sheila, and she just practiced crystals and practiced, you know, this religion, got a little bit from here and a little bit from there. And he said she ended up with Sheilaism, you know, her own religion of her own making. And but you wonder how many people who said, you know, they had enough church in them to know that, well, got to go to church and all that. But as you said, David Preston, there wasn't that new life in Christ in them, the transformative power of the Spirit. I mean, why change? You know, I'm going to church. I'm doing my hour on Sunday morning.
You've hit on something there, and talking about her, you don't even have to be someone who burns incense and worships crystals or whatever to have Sheilaism. My natural state is Davidism. You know, I am my God, my own God, right? And you know, so that's at the heart of it is changing the God that I've created in me, or that is in me by my human nature, to be transformed, right? Go back to metamorphosis again, transformed through the renewing of our mind, our being, our self, all of those attributes, you know, all of those functions, that way. And that's at the heart of our Christian discipleship, you know, because it is a work, it's a process, it's a following, a teaching, it's a knowing, all of that, and it is a lifelong process.
What I know you've shared what you shared earlier with me, you know, over lunch, but is it sort of the cumulative effect of like a Emmaus spiritual retreat weekend where the people say that, or is it perhaps after a particular talk that they hear on the weekend where I know different people have different experiences, obviously, but when you hear phrases like, I've never heard this before and I've gone to church, you know, what is there one that seems to get the aha moment more than others as far as talk?
I would say it's more a cumulative effect over a weekend, and it's because a lot of them have never been challenged to look at themselves before. You know, again, they've just sort of been affirmed. Oh, look, I go to church every Sunday. I was raised in the church. I was confirmed in the church, you know, whatever. But you know, hey, I do all this other stuff that has no relationship whatsoever. It has no impact. And because that's been the focus, or the tendency of our culture, to do that. So again, it's hiding. It's the aspect of our culture that's hiding in plain sight in the church. And so people are not challenged. They're not made to understand, yes, discipleship is costly. Grace is free. But being a follower of Christ costs something. It costs us, something dearly. We have to take up our cross. We have to allow ourselves to be crucified daily. All of those things.
So as our culture, continues down the road, and civil religion isn't, the rule of the day, where everybody feels like on Sunday morning you need to be at church. People now, that doesn't even occur. I just know my own lifetime as a pastor and with having children, Wednesday nights and Sunday mornings were unthinkable about sports for kids. And now it's standard. It's not even a dilemma anymore. Of course, we're going to have a tournament on this day, or, practice on this night. But I'm wondering, and David Mullins, I'll toss this to you. There's a whole category now, they've always existed, but now they're being categorized because, my goodness, we love to categorize things.
Yes, we do.
But there are the nuns, and I don't mean Catholic nuns,
yes,
but the NONES, where there's no religious affiliation, and then it's jumped from like single digits to 25 to 30% somewhere, depends on who you read. It doesn't mean they don't believe in Jesus, even. It doesn't mean they're not. It just means that they're not connected, or they don't want to say they're connected to a particular belief or church or whatever. So it's sort of a non-affiliated group, and it's a little ambiguous, and it depends on what they're being asked and things like that. I understand all that. But, with what David Preston was saying, about we're not in the church, we're not even living according to our own standards.
Right.
And we can cover it up a lot, but I'm wondering, does that give rise to the nuns just saying, hey, if it's not changing their life, why should I get on board? And secondly, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites. It's like, you're telling us this, that, and the other, and you're not doing that. What's going on there, do you think?
Well, and I've got family members like this, and so and they are, look, the people I have in mind as I say this are deeply devoted Christians. I mean, there is a deep faith, there is a deep walk. They are in the Word, they are seeking Him in prayer. They're missing the fellowship component, they're missing the church component, and in one case that was because of people who were doing stuff that was definitely not out of the mind of Christ, in official positions in the church, and they got burned. And about that same time, life situations changed, and they said, we're just going to roll with it, and we can do Jesus on our own. And these are well-discipled people too. I mean, I'm going to lay that out there. So you've got a disillusionment with the church, when the church is not, when the church is being more like the world than it is being like Christ. You've got people who got disillusioned with that. I think the house church movement has been fueled by that in many ways. We had several people in the last town I was served in, that some of them went to our church and then were in a house church with other people who, some of whom had been former members of our church, that just had gotten burned over time. But it really does, when we're not living with the mind of Christ, when we're not acting out of that, and we're living out of the world, we're shedding people left and right, because they're saying, well, all I'm getting out of this is pain. I'm not getting discipleship. I'm not getting growth. All I'm getting is this junk. Yeah. And then you add into that, I think, COVID. I hate to blame everything on COVID, but the fact of the matter is, it broke habits for a lot of people, and a lot of people haven't come back. And it's not because they're concerned about immunity issues. There are still some who are, and some who pick and choose their weeks based on what the numbers and flu season and everything else are doing and whatnot. It's hard to blame them on that one, but it's if for a lot of people, we had all these conversations about what was essential and what was optional, and for them, church became optional because it wasn't, they weren't seeing any fruit from that time there. They weren't seeing that they were getting anything out of it. And or that what they were getting from it was negative. And so,
or that they could become spectators. They could watch it on television, and that was a pseudo, a simulacrum, of being in church. You got some religiosity, you got a lesson, but you didn't have to, you could stay in your PJs and drink your coffee.
Yeah.
That's a very passive experience, isn't it? I mean, that's just.
But is that very much different than what a lot of people are doing in the pews?
Well, no,
that's the thing.
Point.
And I'm not,
there you go. Yeah.
Well, and let me say, I'm not blaming those folks. I'm blaming us,
right?
Where we have not engaged people, where we have not been intentional about discipleship. Folks who have sat in the pews passively, it's because that's been what's been encouraged.
And that's the whole thing about my experience, the Emmaus experience there of, that's not necessarily those folks' fault. For some of them, they bear a little responsibility because they weren't curious. They didn't really try to pursue anything, but that's been the focus. The church made it easy to do that. We don't talk about hell and death and sin and the wages of sin and all that. We talk about, love and peace and, come by here, Lord.
Yeah.
So,
well, guys, that's a good place to end. That's a good conversation. Hey, I know we've only had 3.
Wait, we haven't.
Might be our best.
Sing it. We should sing it. Sing our way right out here.
We're gonna let you. Yeah.
Well, that beats the Tina Turner reference earlier. So,
So as we depart today, we're going to let David Preston sing us out. Anyway, well, guys, thank y'all. We'll end there. That was great. That was convicting and encouraging and all that. But you're right. We've got some responsibility as the church, and we can't always lay things on the laps of others. We need to be be about our Father's business and make some disciples. So anyway, okay, guys. Well, hey, I want to just thank everybody who stopped by and listened to or watched the podcast today. So glad you did. Hope that you got something out of this. Hope there's some encouragement, maybe even some conviction. I know I felt that. But we will hopefully, God willing, and the creek don't rise, we will see you next week. Have a great day.
See ya.